It's His idea that those whom He has called into Himself, those who have heard His teaching and received it, it's Jesus' idea that they be taken into the trial. I don't know of anything that is more universally terrifying than the open sea. Most people are terrified of open water. I am one of those, even people that work and have spent a lot of time on open water. There is a tremendous fear of the open sea, and for good reason. Think about all the reasons that the sea just has a good reason to be fearful for us, to be afraid of the open sea. First of all, the size of it, the immensity of the open ocean. You can be on the ocean, and as far as the eye can see, the curvature of the earth will only let you see, we're told, on a clear day, 2.9 miles. And on the open water, that's nothing. The Pacific Ocean is 9,600 miles across. So on the clearest of days, you can see 3/10,000ths of the way across the Pacific Ocean. It's incredibly big. And not just to mention the size of it, but just the unknown of what's underneath it. You see the pictures or the videos, or maybe you've been on the open water and you look down and you know that beneath you is a depth of water. You don't even know how deep it is, but you know it's thousands of times deeper than you are tall. Not to mention the unknown things that are living under. There's a whole world living right under the surface that you don't see, that you don't know. We've all read the stories, I'm sure, of how ancient mariners were terrified of what was under the water because they had no idea. They couldn't see down there. They invented all sorts of stories of sea monsters because they didn't know what was under there. That was behind the success of Jaws. We all remember the story of Jaws, the unknown right beneath there, and how it was just waiting to kill you. So it's the terror of the size of the thing, the depth of the thing, the weather. We all know just how susceptible the open water is to sudden storms, not just sudden storms, but severe storms. Not to mention the fact that there's nothing stable on the water. Everything is just bobbing. There's no solid, stable anything to anchor yourself to on the open water. And then, of course, on top of all that is the danger of drowning, because none of us can survive for very long at all in the open water. So the sea is a very terrifying thing, and we can all relate to that. And that's one reason I think that the story that we come to today is so compelling and resonates with us, because this is one of Jesus' most well-known miracles. This is probably one of the most visibly stunning miracles that Jesus performs. If you think about it, many of Jesus' miracles were not necessarily all that visually startling. Many of His miracles, you sort of had to know the backstory to be amazed by it. For example, you had to know that this particular man was born blind and had been blind for 40 years to be stunned by the fact that he now sees. Or you had to know that this man had been paralyzed and couldn't walk up until a few moments ago in order to be stunned by what Jesus just did. Many of His miracles, like as He healed Peter's mother-in-law in Mark chapter 1, wasn't all that visually startling. The baskets of bread and fish that just never depleted, never gave out. Not necessarily visually stunning, but when we come to this miracle, I think this is one of the two miracles that Jesus performed that at its very sight was amazing, astounding. This put together with the miracle of walking on the water, both of them, Jesus showing His dominance over the sea that we'll talk about a little bit later. But both of those were visually stunning miracles, on par with, of course, the parting of the Red Sea, another water miracle. And so the miracle that we come to today, the calming of the sea, is a miracle that we will find both compelling, interesting, and also one that will have great relevance to our lives. So if we are together here in Mark chapter 4, let's begin by reading the text together. We're still on page 998 if you're in a pew Bible. And we'll be looking at verses 35 down through verse 41. Beginning from verse 35, on that day when evening had come, He said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took Him with them in the boat, just as He was. And other boats were with Him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. but he was in the stern asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? So in turning to this story, we turn a whole new page in the Gospel of Mark. We know, as we've said before, that the chapter divisions in our Bibles are artificial. They were all added later for our benefit to help us navigate our way around the Scriptures, the chapter divisions as well as the verse divisions. And oftentimes they're helpful, sometimes they're less than helpful. So we know that the original manuscripts didn't have chapter divisions. In fact, when Mark wrote this account, there was no such thing as chapters. That was a literary device that won't be invented for centuries after Mark wrote this. But if there were chapter divisions in Mark's day, and if we were to ask Mark, where are the chapter divisions in your gospel? Then he would have said to us, I'm almost certain, that we just turned into a new chapter. Because what we turn to today is a change of pace, it's a change of direction. And so let's just spend just a couple of minutes and let's just refresh our memory for how Mark has brought us to this point. And let's just observe the previous chapters in Mark's line of thinking. And let's just see where he's taking us. Because if I were in your position and I were listening to someone exposit the Gospel of Mark to me week after week, it would help me, I would appreciate to know where Mark is going, what the themes are that he's developing so that I can look for them myself. Because if I can look for them and see them myself, then it'll be more meaningful to me. So I would appreciate it if I was listening to an exposition of the Gospel of Mark or any book of the Bible, if someone were to say to me, this is the theme that Mark is going to be developing over these stories. So if we think back to the beginning, I think that Mark would say to us, if we were to ask him here today, or just read what he's written and just see the clear divisions of thought, I think he would say to us that chapter 1 of his gospel, of course, began at the beginning. And then there was the introduction, and Jesus is declared to be the Son of God. Then there is the introduction of John the Baptizer, the heralder of Jesus. And then there's the baptism of John, the anointing of Jesus by the Spirit. Jesus goes into the wilderness for his temptation. Then after that, he chooses his very first disciples. And then the story begins in earnest. And it begins with these accounts of these miracle stories combined together with powerful teaching stories, intermixed with stories of opposition against Jesus, stories of disbelief. And so we see the miracles taking place, we see the healings, we see the casting out the demon, the healing of the man with a withered hand, the cleansing of the leper, those miracles. We also see the disbelief, and we also read about the powerful teachings. And that section ends in chapter 3, verse 6, with this declaration of disbelief and opposition. Chapter 3, verse 6, if you want to look there with me, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. I think that's a clear division in Mark's story from that point. Up until that point, there's been miracle stories, powerful teaching, also indications of disbelief, and then it all ends with this statement of disbelief. Then the next chapter, Mark's chapter 2, begins in our chapter 3, verse 7. And in that section, Mark is showing us why there is such a disparity in reactions to Jesus. The crowds are so enthusiastic, so excited about Jesus, so supportive of his miracles. But then the Pharisees are so opposed to him. They want to have him killed. And so Mark attempts to show us how that is and what are the reasons behind it. So he begins by showing us these 4 opposition stories, how Jesus is opposed by the Pharisees. He goes from that to the stories, the first of his sandwich technique, the bracket technique, that's his favorite technique. And he brackets together these 2 stories. One is the story of his family opposing him, and the other is the story of the Pharisees who come up from Jerusalem to oppose him. And in the middle of that, we get the teaching of what we know as the unpardonable or the unforgivable sin, which is the persistent, continued, enlightened blasphemy. Having been shown the revelation of Jesus, having understood that Jesus is the Son of God, nevertheless refusing to yield or submit to that, that is what we said was the sin of the enlightened blasphemy. And so in that, Mark is giving us examples of what it is in the heart, because that's what the issue is. The issue is the heart that receives this enlightenment or this knowledge of Jesus, yet refuses to submit. That is the basis for why some people are so enthusiastic about Jesus and others are so opposed to him. Then we go from that to the section of the parables, the 5 or 6 parables, depending on how you divide them up, the 5 or 6 parables that are all about the same thing, teaching about the heart, the soil of the heart, the parable of the soils, the parable of the seeds, the parable of the lamp, the parable of the measures. And so in those parables, Mark is teaching the same thing. He's putting together these parables of Jesus to show us the issue is the heart. When the heart receives enlightenment or understanding that Jesus is the Christ and yet refuses to submit to that, that is the root of these differing reactions to Jesus. Then that section we completed last week with the last of the parables. That would have been what I would see as Mark's chapter 2. Now Mark's chapter 3 begins here at the end of our chapter 4, beginning from verse 35. Now in chapter 4, Mark returns once again to the miracles of Jesus, and he returns to recounting some of the miracles of Jesus. And just like Mark's chapter 1, he's going to follow the same pattern. He's going to show us some miracle stories, and that section will conclude with once again a statement of disbelief and opposition. The statement of disbelief and opposition this time is going to be the story of Jesus being rejected in his hometown of Nazareth and how he could not do many mighty works there because of their lack of faith. But before that, Mark is going to tell us these 4 miracle stories, similar to how he's told us the miracle stories in his first chapter. But there's going to be 5 crucial differences. And here we kind of cut to the chase. These are some of the themes that we'll be looking at over the next coming weeks. These themes that we'll just go ahead and look at them now so that we see them, we recognize them, and we'll see clearly all 5 of these things in all 4 of the next miracles. Then the next section will include these 4 miracle stories, and then once again we'll conclude, once again, just like chapter 1 concluded, with an episode of unbelief and opposition. So the 4 miracle stories that we'll be looking at, of course, today is the calming of the sea, calming of the storm. After this is the miracle of the Gerasene demoniac and the demons known as Legion and casting them out into the pigs, and then the villagers come out. And then next is this dual miracle that Mark sandwiches together into one story. It's the 2 miracles of the woman with the flow of blood, sandwiched together with the miracle of the raising of Jairus' daughter back to life. And then Mark concludes that section with, once again, an episode of unbelief, disbelief, and rejection as Jesus is rejected in his hometown of Nazareth. So the 5 things that we'll see developed in all 4 of these miracles are as follows. First of all, we see that Mark slows down the pace and his recounting of the miracles gets more detailed. In the first chapter, the miracles were more or less faceless, nameless sorts of miracles. We really didn't know the people that were the objects of Jesus' miraculous activity. We knew Peter's mother-in-law, but that was all. We didn't know any names. We didn't know much about any of the people that were the recipients of Jesus' miracles. There was the leper. We were given so very little information about the leper. The man with the withered hand, Jesus told him to come forth. The man who was possessed by the unclean spirit in the synagogue. All those miracles we were given so very little information about, just a sentence or 2. Now Mark slows down and he's going to give us a lot more information, more details. The miracles are now going to become faces attached to them and stories attached to them. We're going to be drawn into the boat with the disciples. We're going to be drawn into the tortured mind of the Gerasene demoniac. We're going to be invited into the topsy-turvy life of the woman with the 12-year flow of blood. We're going to be invited into Jairus' anguish as his daughter is on her deathbed and Jesus can't quite get there in time. We're going to be drawn to that. We're told their names. We're told something about them. And so Mark's giving us many more details. Secondly, each of the 4 miracles is going to have with it a theme of desperation. All 4 of these miracles are performed in a situation of desperation. Now, that's not to say that Jesus' other miracles weren't also performed in situations of desperation. They were. Some of them were, at least. Certainly the leper was desperate for Jesus to heal him. The paralytic's friends were desperate to get their friend to Jesus. But there were also some miracles that weren't necessarily so desperate. Jesus, after all, called the man with the withered hand to come forth because he wanted to heal him. So the sense of desperation is much less. It's much more muted in the first section. Now the sense of desperation is heightened. It's acute. It's sharp. It's right out in front. All four of the miracles are taking place in a desperate situation. Teacher, don't you care that we're all about to drown? Or the Gerasene demoniac crawling face first before Jesus, desperate to be freed from the hell that is his life. Or the woman with the 12-year flow of blood and her desperation to touch Jesus without being known. Or Jairus' desperation that Jesus will get to his house in time. All of these accounts are accounts of people that are desperate. And after all, their desperation, or at least their recognition of their desperation, is what opens them to Jesus' activity. Because Jesus said in chapter 2, I didn't come for the healthy. I came for the sick. Meaning that He came for those who have an acute awareness of their desperate need for Him. So that desperation now becomes front and center. We also see that all the miracles in this section are becoming greater, bigger, if you will. Not that Jesus' miracles in chapter 1 weren't great and grandiose, they were. But the greatness of these miracles really begins to take front and center stage in the next four miracles. After all, Jesus doesn't just calm a storm, He calms the storm of the decade. Jesus doesn't just cast out a demon, He casts out legion. Jesus doesn't just heal a woman with a malady in her body. He heals a woman with a malady that for the last 12 years has stymied every physician that's looked at her and consumed everything she has. Jesus doesn't just heal a little girl. He, after the moment of her death, raises her back from death to life. So the greatness, the grandness of these miracles takes another step forward. We also see that each of these miracles is going to clearly be a deliverance from something, a deliverance from some powerful influence in our life. And that's kind of one of the themes of this section. So we could think about the realm of human experience. We could think about four areas, four things that influence us. And Jesus will address all four of these areas of influences, these things that press against us. He will address each one of them and show His power over them. The miracle today, the calming of the storm, that is meant to teach us that Jesus has power over our external circumstances. The next miracle, the miracle of the casting out of the demons known as legion, is going to show us that Jesus has power over our internal turmoil. The next miracle, the miracle of the woman with the flow of blood, is going to show us that Jesus has power over the sicknesses that attack our bodies. And then lastly, Jesus' raising of Jairus' daughter back to life is going to show us that Jesus has power over the death that we all fear. So all four of those, they constitute the entirety of what can influence us, what can come as pressure against us. And Jesus is going to show us through each miracle that He has power over each of these. Then finally, the theme that we'll see is probably the biggest, most important theme, and that's the theme of faith contrasted against fear. All four of the miracles have that also as front and center, faith and fear, and how the Scripture seems to always present those to us as contrary, as opposites. Faith casts out fear. Fear is not present where there is faith, yet where there is faith, where there is little faith and great fear, the fear can push out the faith. That's what Scripture seems to teach us. Now, all four of these miracles are going to put that theme front and center. The miracle of the calming of the storm, the disciples, of course, are gripped with a great fear. After all, they're about to die. And then Jesus calms the storm and He says to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" You see, Jesus plainly says, faith casts out fear. If you've got fear, that means that your faith is either weak or non-present. Then the next story, the story of the casting out of the demons known as legion, we're going to see the fear of the villagers as they see and they hear about what Jesus has done, and they're filled with fear. And all they want is for Jesus to leave. And so there's this choice between fear and faith. The disciples have chosen fear, or they've been forced to choose fear. The villagers in the village near the Gerasene demoniac's home, or his home is in the cemetery, the villagers there, they choose fear over faith, and they ask Jesus to leave. Then the following story, the story of the woman with the flow of blood, she also has great fear. We're told in the passage that she's very fearful of being discovered. She's very fearful that it's going to be discovered that this unclean woman has touched Jesus. And she's very fearful that it'll be known what she is and what she has. Yet, in that story, her faith is greater than her fear because Jesus says to her, your faith has made you well. She is fearful, yet her faith was stronger and pushes the fear out. And then finally, the story of Jairus' daughter. Jairus is, of course, very fearful. We're told that he's fearful that Jesus won't get there in time. But Jesus says to Jairus, he says, do not fear, only believe. Or in other words, only faith instead of fear. So each of these four stories is going to have for us as one of its primary themes the contrast of faith and fear. In addition to that, each story is going to show us Jesus' powerful influence, His powerful sovereign control over all the influences of our life. In addition to that, we're going to see the increasing greatness of the miracles. We're also going to see that now all the miracles really are becoming up close and personal. Even Jesus' rejection is now up close and personal. Whereas before it was just these nameless Pharisees that probably didn't even know Jesus before his public ministry began. Now it's his hometown. Those whom he grew up with, those who knew him since young boyhood. They are the ones who won't believe and who reject him. Everything is much more up close and personal now. So hopefully that helps us to just kind of see ahead over the next coming weeks where Mark is going to take us. Now, having said all that, let's now turn to the text and let's begin from chapter 4. Once again, chapter 4 and verse 36. So we begin looking at this story with these words. On that day, so we're reminded of back in chapter 4 and verse 1. Chapter 4, verse 1, again, he began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea, and he began to teach. So this is the same day. On that day, so earlier that morning, Jesus got in the boat and began teaching. And the parables that he taught, a couple of them are related to us, the parable of the soils, the parable of the seeds, but many other parables because Jesus taught throughout the day, because Mark is the one that's going to tell us that the time that Jesus leaves now is the evening. So the day is spent. He's been in the boat teaching all day. He's thoroughly exhausted. He's been on this boat teaching the crowds on the shore all day. On that day, when evening had come, so the day is now spent, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. So Jesus is the one who initiates to them, let us leave this place and let us go to the other side. Jesus initiates the leaving. Jesus' idea is for us to leave this and go to the other side. Jesus knows very well what's going to happen on the ocean, or not the ocean, but the Sea of Galilee. He knows very well what's about to happen. It's his idea that they leave the safety of the shore. It's his idea that they leave at the end of the day, so they'll be crossing the Sea of Galilee at night. It's his idea that they do this and go across. So those who are the inner circle of Jesus, those who are the ones whom he's called to himself, the church, the called out ones, these are the ones that Jesus takes into the open sea. Because look at the passage. When evening had come, he said to them, let us, and that word us, let us, throughout the whole passage, that refers to this group of people Jesus has called unto himself. Those whom he desired, he called himself. The called out ones, the church, so to speak. He said, let us go across to the other side, and leaving the crowd. So the crowd, there's a differentiation here. Mark says that he's now left the crowd. Jesus and the called out ones have left the crowd, and they themselves took with him in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. So there's a collection of boats, like a little flotilla. Boats crossing the Sea of Galilee. We talked about the Sea of Galilee before. About 13 miles long, about 7 miles wide. So he's going to go to the other side. If we look down at chapter 5, verse 1, they came to the other side. And the other side is the country of the Gerasenes, where the demoniac lives. So that is about anywhere from a 7 to a 10 mile journey over water. And so picture in your mind this little flotilla of boats. Back in, I think it was about the mid-'80s, there was a fishing boat that was discovered about 5 miles south of Capernaum. And this fishing boat, they dated it to the lifetime of Jesus. Possibly, there's a slim chance it was actually this boat, although it's extremely unlikely. But nevertheless, it was the same type of boat. That boat measured about 27 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, about 4 feet tall. And so that would have been very typical for this size boat, this type of boat, about 25 to 30 feet long, 7, 8, maybe 9 feet wide, about 4 feet tall. Now, the boat that was discovered, they discovered that the boat actually had a deck built into it. So it wasn't just an open hulled boat like a rowboat or a John boat, but it had a deck built onto it. So it had a floor. So this would have been like the boats that Jesus was using. They would hold about 15 or so people. So we don't know how many boats it was, but it was just a small number, maybe 3, 4, or 5. So we're talking about maybe 50 people that Jesus has called unto himself, the called out ones, the ecclesia. So the image that we're given here is a wonderful image. It's the image of Jesus and his followers, his called out ones, or the church, on these little boats crossing the sea. Now, the sea in Scripture, particularly the Old Testament, the sea represents for us, it's a metaphorical representation of the rule of evil in this age, the chaos of evil in this age. The Old Testament prophets use that imagery often. The sea represents the chaos, the rule of evil. So picture in your mind Jesus and this little group of boats, his called out ones, and they are floating across the sea, which represents the sea of the rule of evil or the chaos of evil in this world. And here's Jesus with his followers. And brings to mind another picture, doesn't it? Another picture of the entirety of the people of God also on another boat called the Ark. In that case, in which they were traveling across the sea, that in that case was the judgment of God against the sin of the world. But nevertheless, the ark carrying God's people, here these flotilla of boats carrying the people of God across to the other side. Now, as they're going across to the other side, Jesus, of course, knows what they're headed into. And so Jesus himself, it's his idea to take them into this storm. It's his idea that those whom he has called into himself, those who have heard his teaching and received it, those who have heard his teaching and believed, it's Jesus' idea that they be taken into the trial. Remember the story of the parable of the soils and the parable of the shallow soil, that as soon as that plant springs up to life, which represents a profession of belief, a profession of faith, the sun comes up immediately. So we said then that when we profess belief, when we profess faith, when we hear the words of God and receive them, what's coming is the sun, what's coming is the pressure, what's coming is a trial. Likewise, Jesus takes his people into the storm. It's his idea to take them into the storm.